All right, Mini Med School, welcome back. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final session of Mini Med School. Thank you so much for joining us for these 4 sessions. We've really enjoyed having all of you attend, and I hope you found these sessions to be really valuable. We hope to be back in person next year, which does not mean we will not have a virtual component. We'll definitely do kind of a hybrid situation, but we miss seeing you in person. So we hope you think about attending with us in person next fall. So let's get this thing started. I want to introduce your host for the evening. I know we typically have Dr. Suki Dillon as our program director, and she unfortunately can't be here this evening. She really wants to, and she will see you again next year. But we have somebody amazing back here in person for us that was hand-selected by Dr. Dillon, so you know she's good. I want to introduce you to Dr. Jessica Martin Moreno. So Dr. Martin Moreno, she's an emergency medicine resident here at UCSF Fresno. She's originally from Fresno and is excited to be back home for residency training. She received her Bachelor of Science degree in neurobiology, physiology, and behavior with a minor in sociology. You were so busy. You were so busy. From UC Davis. After doing a post-baccalaureate program at UC San Diego, she attended medical school at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine, Go Green, and graduated in May of 2019. During medical school, she was an active member of the Latino Medical Student Association, both at the Midwest regional level as mentorship chair and at the CHM chapter level as former co-president. She participated in the Leadership in Medicine for the Underserved program at the Flint campus and completed 2 international medicine electives in Costa Rica. Sounds intriguing. I want to hear more about that later. During her time in residency, she has been a guest speaker for the Doctors Academy, which some of you may know, and Junior Doctors Academy. She is also a member of various operations committees regarding patient care. Lastly, she's a UCSF Fresno Park Medic resident, and absolutely fascinating program. I hope you talk about that too and tell them all about it. And helps with the education and training program for the Park Medic Rangers in our national park system. In her spare time, she enjoys Olympic weightlifting with Atlas Barbell Club and being outside with her husband and her dog. So welcome, Dr. Martin Moreno.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction and welcome everybody. I know I have been here in the past and have moderated something before or participated in a panel, but I can't exactly remember what session it was last year, but I'm glad to be back. And luckily, Suki thought of me when she realized she was unable to make it. So thanks to Dr. Dillon for nominating me to handle this panel today. So first, we're going to start off the first hour with Summer, I think you were going to do a poll, or are we done with the poll?
Yeah, let's do a quick poll.
Okay.
Let's do a little poll that I'm going to drop into the chat, and then I will share my screen with everyone. Okay, so there you go. That's in the chat. I'm going to share my poll. And we're just going to make it really simple. So, what is one word you associate with the field of medicine? And you can go ahead and click on that link. It'll hopefully take you here. And let's see what you say. I'm excited to see. One word you associate: blood. Curative, patient, compassion. I love it. Keep them coming, guys. Keep them coming. Wonderful. We'll keep on chiming in. We love to see what medicine means to you, and I hope that you found some of this in some of our sessions that we had. Oh, nice. Perfect. Keep them coming because I want to keep this guy. This is great. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Nice. Okay, I think there's one more thing I wanted to share in the chat with everyone. And for those of you who have been asking about certificates, which we typically give out at the end of Mini Med School, I'm going to put in the chat the link to a survey that you can take if you want to receive that certificate. So just go ahead and fill that out, and then I will email that to you. Okay, and with that, I think we've got all the housekeeping. Oh wait, let's talk about Q&A. So for today's Q&A, it's going to be a little bit different than what we typically do. If you have something that you would like to ask during any of the presentations, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A section. But at the end of each session, we hope to have a little bit of extra time to answer any of your questions live. So at that point, it'd be great if you could raise your hands. We'll go ahead and call on you. If you want, we can open your mic, your video if you're interested. We'd love to see you and hear from you live. So we'll probably do the Q&A a little bit more interactively this time, but okay, that's all for me. Go ahead. Over to you, Dr. Martin Moreno.
No problem. All right, so for our first hour, we actually have someone speaking to us who I adore greatly, and he is one of my mentors within community medicine. So we have Dr. Kenny Bond. Dr. Kenny Bond is an associate professor of clinical emergency medicine, assistant dean of undergraduate medical education, and director of the Mobile Heal COVID Equity Project at UCSF Fresno. Born and raised in rural Pennsylvania, he attended the University of Pennsylvania for college and Drexel University College of Medicine for his medical degree. He completed his emergency medicine residency at UCSF Fresno and has been a practicing academic physician here for almost 2 decades. He has over 150 publications, has spoken at both state and federal congressional events, and awards include the California Medical Association's Compassionate Service Award and guest at President Joe Biden's Joint Congressional Address. So without further ado, here's Dr. Kenny Bond.
Thank you so much, both Summer and Dr. Martin, for that introduction. I appreciate you guys running this. So, hey, so welcome everybody. Happy to be here. This is a little free form. I've done this before, but I love to hear from you guys. As mentioned, we're going to do a little Q&A at the end here and leave a little more open time. So this session is actually going to focus a little bit on myself. I'll start with my job, but really it's about myself and then my journey through medicine and how that models what we talk about physicians in the future. So first off is, why am I sitting here? Why am I talking to you guys in the beginning? In the first place. And so, yes, I'm an emergency physician. Yes, I'm an assistant dean. I sit on a bunch of committees, work on a bunch of workshops and different little pathway programs on growing physicians in the region. But probably the biggest thing that I've gotten in the last year or two is my work with my Mobile Heal project. For you guys to know, I'll give you a little background. I started Mobile Heal about 3 years ago as a passion project. I was working as the dean. I was working as emergency medicine physician, but I felt that we could be doing more within the community. All the other medical schools had all these free student-led service clinics, and we didn't have anything in the Valley. We're just so physician starved. I had lots of pre-med students asking for clinical opportunities. So I wanted to really open up the doors for, great college students like yourselves, which many of you guys are on the panel here, to get more opportunities to interface with physicians in training, medical students, residents, in underserved communities learning culturally competent care. That's something I'm really passionate about. So about this past year, that kind of changed gears a little bit because this little thing called COVID happened. You might have heard of it, once or twice. It temporarily held those operations, but I was asked by the city and the county and a few other groups in order to see if we could help with a COVID response unit. We don't have enough our healthcare was fragile, not enough doctors, nurses to provide COVID services. So I'll show you a little clip highlighting some of that for those who may or may not know. As long as I can get my shared screen working here in just 1 second.
To get vaccinated. 7 days a week, the UCSF Fresno COVID-19 Equity Project holds a drive-through vaccine clinic across from Fashion Fair Mall. In line, we met Pedro L., who's getting his first dose of Pfizer.
I'll be able to sleep better knowing that I'm vaccinated and I can actually go places now.
The FDA approved the Pfizer vaccine Monday, removing a layer of concern about its safety for many.
We've been hearing a lot of things, how everybody's saying not to get it and get it and get it. We're just going to go ahead and go through with it.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data looks at attitudes toward COVID-19 vaccines by race. Findings show 17% of white adults and 14% of black adults say they would probably not or definitely not get a vaccine. That's compared to 12% of Hispanic adults and 2% of Asians.
In certain communities of color, for instance, I'll take African American being probably the most common one that we discussed, is that we have years of institutional racism being built in, and that includes in healthcare as well.
On top of that, questions about the safety safety, efficacy, and side effects of vaccines, distrust in the government, and disinformation online also influence vaccine hesitancy.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who kind of, the Facebook doctors out there that are just sort of, catching on to things that don't really have evidentiary support as well.
And for some, political beliefs are stopping people from getting vaccinated.
There are certain groups that are just flat out vaccine resistant.
Medical experts say a lack of access also impacts vaccine rates. The UCSF Fresno COVID-19 Equity Project hosts about 45 pop-up vaccine clinics a month in hard-to-reach communities.
So a big job is not just coming to those areas and providing access, but also doing education and working with community-based organizations and leadership so you can kind of build trust in that community.
All right, so as many of my friends say, I'm a TV doctor, not a real doctor anymore. So I go around talking about it a lot and doing education. My newest project in the last 2 weeks is we just rolled out monoclonal antibodies. So for those who get infected or exposed, and now we're the first sort of drive-through, no appointment monoclonal antibody site in the whole Central California. So we're always working on something new. I still work shifts in the ER. I still actually cover the ICU. I covered the COVID ICU last week. And so I have a really interesting slice where I get to see patients from the asymptomatic to the sniffles to all the way to the, unfortunately, dying patients right in their last moments from COVID. So, and try to do as much good as I can in that. So it's really been a passion project that has grown, and we hope to continue to grow it in ways. But it's funny because it was actually built originally for outreach, right? It was built with two purposes: one, to address health inequities in patient populations within the Valley, and secondarily to open up opportunities for learners, medical students, pre-med students, to work in underserved care and just, say the thing that you went into med school for and still kind of, still believe in it and find faith and happiness in that. So that's sort of the reason I probably get pulled and talk to the places, but it's actually not what I'm going to talk to you about here. I'm happy to answer questions about the COVID Equity Project, Mobile Heal, and the Free Student Clinic, and how do we start with that, or how you can volunteer. We can put the information of that in the chat. But I'd actually like to talk a little bit about the background of myself and where I was. So I'll take a step back from them if that's okay. So I'll say my story really starts on a boat. We're drifting a sea. I am not even here yet, actually. We're just rocking across endless oceans, hoping somebody's going to save us. I actually am talking about my family, my parents, my brothers. My brothers are actually, I'm the youngest of three. My brothers are a newborn and a 1.5-year-old. Basically clutched to my parent, clutched to my mom. We're refugees from Vietnam, war-torn Vietnam. Vietnam War happened, 1975, end of the war. They fled. They had come across and jumped onto boats and ran onto it, all the scenes you see in the movies. My family was in there. A lot of healthcare issues, lots of problems, obviously, with any war-torn government that happened during this. A lot of people didn't make it out. I actually had an older sister that my parents didn't tell me years ago that was part of that didn't make it, one of those that died before they could ever escape. So, it's interesting, I never met my sister, and I was kind of think about whether I think in my mind, whether I'd even be alive, because if, she'd made it over, maybe my parents would have stopped with 3 and I wouldn't be here. But, they get on this boat and they're sitting there eating instant ramen because that's what you're surviving on. Why? Because that's what you could smuggle on in your packages, and hoping someone picks them up, which is funny because my kids still love instant ramen to this day. My middle one asked for it yesterday. And fortunately, a U.S. ship picks us up, so we're fortunate. Some people get turned away, some people get drift at sea and they starve to death. But we get picked up by a U.S. government ship. We get shipped to Guam, Hawaii, all sorts of places. My parents get placed in a refugee camp. Most of the military bases on the East Coast were converted over to refugee camps to take all the Vietnam refugees at the time. So I come over, and that's where I'm born. I'm actually born in a refugee camp when they first come over fairly early on. And so, I'm born in the hospital, actually, which is funny because some of people aren't actually born, don't get to the hospital, aren't born right there on the boat or in the camp themselves. But I grow up in the camp and eventually get, taken over to, my parents are sponsored by a church group, and they help them set up in a trailer park. So I grew up in a trailer park. That's, my first 10 years of life, basically. So I kind of joke that, I'm trailer trash. My parents don't have an education. We've, had to escape a country with just whatever we had, what could hold on to. My parents both work in factories their whole lives. They do, forever and ever until they retire, because that's all they could do is without education here in the US, and just trying to do the American dream, right? Try to have a better life. But it's funny because it's not even a better life for them. It's a better life for us, right? They escaped not for them. They had more resources there, but they were running away from communism. So I have lots of jokes running through my family. Like my grandparents actually are Chinese, and they ran from the Cultural Revolution and communism in China. And then in Vietnam, my parents ran from communism. So every generation we just run from communism. So I'm waiting for my cue to run to Mexico or something like that. I have to escape communism again. So I think I'm happy that I'm staying here. So I'm grew up in a small trailer home in rural Pennsylvania. Life is pretty hard, making ends meet. My dad becomes a tool and die maker because it's what he was a helicopter pilot actually over in Vietnam, working for the U.S. Army, for South Vietnamese, like working on their side, sponsoring on their military. So he flew helicopters, trained in Texas, but then he, didn't have the training here. So he went and worked in a factory as a machinist. We eventually moved to a very small house, little 2-bedroom house. That's where most of my memories are. And I spent most of my life in this 2-bedroom house. But the fact that we had a house made us like the richest of all the families, because everyone else comes in afterwards. All the refugees are coming over. And so most of my life I spend in this 2-bedroom house with 15 people living in it, cousins, uncles, aunts, sleeping on the floor in the basement or in the attic or ever in the closet or whatever. I spend most of my days, it's funny, this crowded house, you think it's like with low resources and, scrambling for food and where you're going to live and if you're going to stay there. And, my childhood is actually filled with really good memories. It's funny just reflecting on it, because regardless whether your clothes are hand-me-downs, it's like I had family and cousins and uncles entertaining and, bicycle rides, exploring the woods and, things I don't, my kids don't even have enough of sometimes. It's just this free-form play with large groups of people and a lot of love. And, we used to, my parents would pick up these little hair barrettes, which is like, like you get at the mall when malls still existed, that you get for like, $5 and, little hair clips. And I remember we used to pick them up from New York and Philadelphia and take home these boxes, these crates of 50,000 of them. And we'd sit with a glue gun, sit around the family household after school and after dinner. And I'd sit there and I'd, make hair berets and glue them on and make them. And my mom would make like 3 cents a piece or something for them or something like that. And, in our new age world, I'd say it was like, my kids, I'd do that and I'd pay money for them to have arts and crafts time and constructive things. And now I look back and I'm like, oh, that was, what we call that was child labor. But that's how I grew up. That's what we did. But it was kind of fun. It's really weird because I think about it, and we'd like turn on a TV and we'd sit around with 10 people, sit around on the floor and laugh and joke and eat snacks and work in, in my child sweatshop, apparently. But, it wasn't like it back then. It was what you had to do to survive. So I got to sleep in my parents' room. So we, of course, didn't have our own room. And I slept on my parents' floor. I remember till I was in 5th grade. So the first 10 years of my life, I slept on a mat on the floor next to my parents' bed. And finally, we saved up money again. Everything was about like trying to move to the better school district, trying to, be the poorest house in the best school district always. We moved to a different public school system that had more opportunities, but, we buy the poorest house in there. And I move in with my brother, and I still remember the day because I was wishing for it for like 2 years. And it's really an anchor point in my life because I'm 10 years old. And for the first time in my life, I got a bed. And it was the first, I've been wishing and crying and praying for a bed for like all these years because I've just been sleeping on the floor my whole life. And I get a bed, and it was just like the thing I've been dreaming about all my life. And it's funny because whenever people ask me all these things about like, oh, is it hard, or working nights or working all these shifts, or, you don't have this, or the call room's cold or whatever. And I'm just like, I always sort of reflect on like the day where I was like, I didn't have a bed till I was 10 years old, like it. And I always think about like, when you look about that, or think back on that, that's always your anchor point of like, it's not that bad. Nothing is that bad. you have it really good now. You got a good job, you got a good life, work may be tough, people may be difficult at the moment, but you know, I come home and I have a wonderful family and I can provide for them. And I'm blessed at so many levels. So that I always just keep going back to this 10-year-old kid of myself crying about wishing for 2 years about having a bed and finally getting one. And then and thinking about structures of life and what people need to be healthy, to be happy, to be successful. And it's like, you know, you really, if you don't provide those basic structures, it's really hard to. And it's really hard to think about, you know, other important things about, you know, am I studying for this, or how am I studying for SATs or something like that, when, you know, you don't know where you're sleeping at night, you know. So those are just things I always think about when we talk about, like, you know, public health markers and social determinants of health. Is I was part of that product, you know, thinking about those things, worried about that, food security, housing security, you know, where you got, you know, I was fortunately never, you know, evicted and slept in a car or something, you know, as many other people have, but, you know, that was always the worry. You know, I was really fortunate in school, just to progress a little bit in time, that, you know, I was just kind of lucky and fairly smart, good at school, and all teachers would be like, hey, you should do this and that. I knew nothing about medicine. You know, I was actually taken care of in my town in Lancaster. It's a rural town known for anything. It's Amish country. And there's an unopposed family medicine residency there. That's actually who delivered me, because we were uninsured, Medi-Cal, you know, newly undocumented refugees. So I was delivered by family medicine residents, taken care of by a family medicine resident. That's all I knew was family medicine, you know, doing everything within the hospital. And so they said, you're a smart kid, you should be a doctor. You know, you like sciences, you like people, you're good with this. And, you know, I didn't really know much about it. I spent my summers working, because I had to work in order to pay to save up to go to college, because I didn't know how I was going to pay for college. It's interesting because I didn't have the pre-med advising and the college and all the advising that exists now. And online, it didn't really exist the way it did now. You literally bought books and tried to read about it a little bit. I still remember some of the most obviously stupid things I did. Like, one of the things I did that I try to, you guys don't need to come to these sessions to know this, but like, I spent my whole life trying to fit in, you know, being the poor kid, being the immigrant, being the refugee, being the one with parents that didn't speak English, or the one where, you know, you don't want to be dropped off because your car is, you know, spewing out toxic fumes in the back corner, or doesn't have roll-up windows, you know, and it's taped up on the side. So, you know, I spent all this time trying to cover up my background. It's really interesting now that I'm at where I am, that I spend all my time talking about where I come from and embracing it, when I spent my first half of my life trying to hide myself from it. When I applied to college, you know, I put in my income and things you couldn't hide, but you talk about college education, and I literally lied on my college application and put in that my parents had gone to some college when, you know, they hadn't, and barely had finished high school because of disruption, because of war, because I was so ashamed about like my upbringing and where I'd come from. I'd come from nothing. And it's so funny how it actually hurt my like chances of getting into places, because I didn't even know that that's what they were looking for, that actually worked to my advantage. I was just so ashamed of sort of my background and wanted to make sure that I could just fit in with everybody else. You know, fortunately, I got into a good school, went to University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League University. You know, I'm actually classmates 2 years off from Donald Trump Jr. So it gives you an idea of who I'm like in classes with, you know. We weren't in the same social circle, don't worry. It's a very different world he and I come from, but it gives you an idea of sort of like, this is the first time I've contrasted with sort of from where I'm coming, trying to just fit in with regular middle-class society, but I'd never really seen this other side where people have resources and money, and you know, I'm in my dorm and people are down the hall. My roommate here, is his dad is the owner of Costa Rica Caterpillar, and the only caterpillars I know are the ones that grow on trees that I picked on the summers, you know. So it's just really different. And everyone went to boarding school and all these wonderful upbringings, and their parents are all CEOs of something or electrophysiologists, and my parents work at the plant. You know, it's not to say anything was wrong. There's some great people and very, very nice and intelligent people, but it just was such a contrast of social standing and background. You know, summers were spent for them going to the Swiss Alps for skiing, or, you know, or working with their cardiologist uncle on a research project. And my summers were actually spent going back to the factory where my parents worked, and working at the factory, because that's the only way I would be able to afford to eat when when school was back in session. So I think about that a lot when we talk about pre-med and pathway programs and summer opportunities. I'm like, what are you doing for paying for it? Because, I couldn't not get an income during the summer because I didn't know how I was going to survive in college going for the next year. So I worked as resident advisor. I did all sorts of things so I could hustle and get room and board paid for throughout, all through college. So fast forward a little bit more, shockingly, despite all my stumbles and foibles, I, get lucky enough, I get accepted to multiple medical schools, and I get into Drexel, great medical school. I meet my future wife, who is a Californian, who is a displaced Californian, as many of people are, where about 60% of California medical grads actually leave the state in order to attend because there's not enough spots, which is a separate issue we can talk about here later. And she's in med school in Philadelphia, wonderful person. We decided to come back over to the West Coast, closer to her family. Having said that, I really had a mission of working for underserved medicine, working for pathways in medical education, and I really wanted to look for a program that worked with first-gen students, that treated a safety net population. In emergency medicine, it's funny, in California, there's actually only 2 large trauma centers that do that. There's LA County USC and UCSF Fresno. There's only 2. All the others are actually a significant tier lower as far as volume and pathology. So I rotated at USC because she was at LA County. She was from LA. And gosh, I actually really hated it there. I wanted to love it so much, but it was at the time under probation for various reasons, and it was a very caustic environment, hostile work environment. So the residents were really unhappy and overworked and burnt out. And so I rotated there wanting to love it. And then, I came up here and I said, this is it. This is what I was looking for, even though not being from the Valley. And that was, like I said, as Dr. Martin said, almost 20 years ago, and here I am. I stayed on as faculty with the idea of building a medical school here. I was offered by the prior dean, not just a job as an academic emergency medicine physician, but a chance to build a program that would eventually be a medical school here in the Valley. And that really appealed to me. Medical school that targeted creating a physician pipeline that represented patients, a diverse one with that targeted communities of color and first generation, things that have always struck very strongly with me. So I stayed on as an EM doctor, and I've held almost every single job at the university, outside of janitor, but maybe I should do that too. I'd like to check that box as well. So I've been clerkship director, and I started the first medical education fellowship here. I've been director of UME and now assistant dean. And, I started the student run clinic because I really wanted to have that pathway, because I kept asking my medical students, what do we need? And we needed to build this, and it was on my bucket list. So I lived my life really interestingly, because you have to try to craft a job, now that I've been attending for many years, but I've sort of lived to tenets on my life about doing things that are meaningful to me, not making decisions based on money, but making decisions based on passion and based on meaning, like great meaning to me. And my wife is the same way. She's a practicing pediatrician. She probably takes care of 1/3 of the residents and physicians here and in the practice. And God bless her soul, because I couldn't do that. We love each other, but we're very different people, and that's great. We complement each other, both in strengths and weaknesses. So it's amazing. So I've really loved my job here, and I've really grown into, taking a role in leadership and trying to build the campus here. You've probably heard about SJV Prime. You're going to be talking to many of the students that I've worked with and recruited. I work on expansion programs, and recently got $15 million allocated from the state in order to expand SJV Prime, so that we'll be starting eventually an 8-year program, a BSMD program, a 4-year medical campus here, and we have bills in place in order to expand to 50 students if we can get funding. So, which will hopefully at some point lead to a career with a full-fledged medical school here in the Valley, a UC state-sponsored one. So that's sort of my dream. I'm going to pause for a minute there. Feel free to put in questions in the text. I will answer them sort of at the end, and we can moderate it. I'm going to talk just for a few minutes on admissions, and then we can open it up to the group. So, because, I know a lot of pre-med people are here, and I have sat on admissions for Prime for now 11 years. And, but I'll tell you that, done admissions for a long time, and I want to really touch base on that. But I think my personal story is meant not for, it's never meant to talk about pity. Never meant to talk about like, feel bad or what I've overcome. It's meant to actually talk about future physicians in medicine and what we're looking for. And because it ties into the second part about holistic applications and how we do review and what we're looking for growing physicians, for not just to replace me, right? People who are, I'm mid-career. I'm always looking for who's going to take over my job and do even a better job than me. And I've been around long enough to train medical students and pre-med students that are now my fellow colleagues, and it's amazing. It's a wonderful job. I'm sort of Papa Bond to like so many people, and it's a job and a role I really embrace. But I tell you the story and talk about my struggles, talk about the things I overcame, because I wasn't a perfect applicant. I wasn't a perfect medical student. I was smack dab in that 50th percentile in medical school. Didn't fail anything, but certainly my academic scores didn't get me into interviews. But I did what I cared about. I worked on the things that mattered to me, and I hope that rang true in my applications. And that was really, and if it didn't ring true and it didn't matter to those people, then the place probably wasn't right for me anyway. And so, I take those same sort of motions into my admissions work and looking at pathways and what that means. So, and I hope that inspires you, because we're not looking for a perfect applicant. We're looking for the right person, the people that who are going to be the doctors that are going to serve their communities in whatever aspect that is. So, and like I said, it's meant to inspire, but it's meant to say, it's not about perfect applications. It's not about MCAT scores. It's about thinking about who you are. And yes, their GPAs and MCATs still matter. I'm not going to lie. There's still things that determine whether you can pass your steps and your boards that, people like Dr. Martin Moreno still have to take, to be board certified, that are still standardized tests. So standardized tests don't go away. That you still have to pass them. But it's that we look at applications really differently now. It's not just about who's got the top scores. It's about who has scores that can pass their exams to be a competent physician, but then what else do you bring to the table? So when we talk about a little bit about admissions, you've probably, and I know you can, put in the chat if you're a pre-med. I know that these talks are usually more than 50% to 80% pre-med. If someone's something else, then I apologize if it's not directly relatable to you. But sitting on admissions, you might have talked to different pre-med groups, but you actually usually don't talk to people from admissions themselves. It has to do with a lot of the rules on admissions committees. How as admissions committees, I'm not allowed to talk about some specifics about admissions. So I have to talk about some generalities, and the students can talk about their view on as an applicant and some other things about as a near peer coming into it. But I'll talk about some of the things I look for specifically, and some of the things I hear on admissions committees that I actually kind of disagree with. So I'll talk about the well-rounded applicant and how I sort of quote unquote hate the well-rounded applicant. And why do I do that? Is that it's not that I hate it, it's that the well-rounded applicant that has good grades and has a good MCAT score and has done some volunteering and has worked on 3 different research projects and has kind of checked a lot of boxes. It's not that that student's bad. It's not that student's not going to be a good doctor. It's that the problem is that we get 6,000 applications to medical school every year. And here I am with Prime admitting 12 students into Prime and 160 at UCSF. And I can't admit good students. I have to admit somebody who means something, that makes some impact. So it's interesting, there's certain aspects of your application about fixing deficiencies, which you absolutely need to do. GPAs, MCATs, postbacks, we can talk about specifics about that, research and things like that. But if there's one take-home point about this message is that that you get out of this is, besides being inspired, it's about developing a spike. It's about developing you. I read all these applications all the time, and I there's so many applicants that are like, they're pretty good. They could be good, they could be bad. Here's their risk profile. We talk about it, their academic difficulty, their academic risk. Here's their scores from, other things, all these things we look at, including we talk about the road distance traveled, how difficult they've had it, whether it's socioeconomically, regionally, geographically, ethnically, all these things. We factor in all these things, but ultimately, what I want someone to tell me what kind of doctor they're going to become. And that doctor is not going to be me. It's what doctor you are going to be. And what I mean by that is that if you're going to be a researcher, show me you're going to be a researcher. Don't sit on 3 different research projects and kind of, I was a lab researcher here and did that and this. And then I, dropped out and did a different project and jumped around. Show me that you really mean it. What does that mean? Like, that's like, I mean, like, really do it. Sorry, I lost my my Zoom log down here. I apologize. I'll put that back on. If you're going to do community work, do community work. If you're going to be a volunteer, I've always been passionate about underserved communities and outreach to it. But that doesn't mean just volunteering. That means, how do I take a role? How do I take a leadership role in it? How do I work on a project? Not just did I do so many volunteer hours. The worst thing you do is have like 3 different volunteer work jobs and have us 50 to 100 hours on each of them. It's like, it's very blah. I'm just being honest with it. I want you to do something and then have meaning from it. Get a letter rec from it. Talk about what specific aspect you did. What process did you improve? What leadership role did you take in it? How did you train the next group? How did you make that place better? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about physicians that make their world better, make healthcare better. For some people that maybe I'm from rural Fireball and there's no mental health access and my family dealt with mental health crises and I'm going to be a mental health provider in Fireball. Amazing. Show me that you're going to do that. Do work that actually reinforces that. Don't do something. I see a lot of this like, well, I did research because I was told to do research and I clearly have zero interest in doing research, but this is my application and I check the box on it. Yeah, there's something about like making sure you don't have a deficiency in it, and certainly having a publication helps, but don't go and write your personal statement how you love research and it doesn't ring true. There's a lot of empty statements and a lot of personal statements that I read. If we read 6,000 of them, you need to differentiate yourself. So when we're talking about your application, you're talking about your spider graph and talking about filling out deficiencies. But there's certain things you can only fix, right? You might have a low GPA or a low MCAT. There's certain things you can do about that. But what you can really do is you can really develop that spike. What is that? I was talking to one of my residents today, and they were really dedicated towards refugee and migrant health. So much so that they'd worked on it in college. They'd done it for years. After college, they went into the Peace Corps and went to Rwanda and did refugee health for 2 years, trying to do border health crisis, and to continue to do that here with their current immigration crisis and border health crisis. It's so obvious to me that this is something that this person is so passionate about that it comes through in both their work and their personal statement, right? So this is like, it's very obvious what makes this person tick. And that's what I want. I want to imagine something that when you tell me on your app, this is what you're going to be, I can see it. And that's what I want to take home from it. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. I have not even looked at the chat or the Q&As. So I don't know if Summer has. I just can't. I'm a typical guy and I cannot multitask, so I apologize.
Hey, Dr. Bond, thank you so much. I actually have some questions that people have asked. So I'll start from the top. So it says, thank you for sharing your story so authentically. You mentioned that 60% of medical school grads leave the state. Could you talk more about that? And is it true for undergrad to med school and med school to residency? So I think what they're trying to say is how many undergrads leave the state for med school, and then how many med school graduates leave that state to go to residency?
Fantastic. So great question. So the 60% I'm referring to is for medical school, right? Those are people that enter medical school that are California residents that don't enter medical school in California. So the vast majority have to go, like Dr. Martin Moreno herself, right? Went to Michigan and traveled around, nothing wrong, wonderful school, but there are just literally not enough spots. Despite having this wonderful UC system, I'm from Philadelphia. If you look at Philadelphia, there's 5 medical schools in Philadelphia alone. One city, 5 medical schools. Just to give you an idea of sort of the differentiation. And that's Pennsylvania, which has like a third of the population that California has, less than a third, I think a quarter total. And there's 5 medical schools in one city, just to give people reference for how that system works. In California, a lot of it's just from time. These places got established, so new schools were harder to open. So there's a huge amount of schools and residencies along the Northeast corridor and actually the Midwest. So that differentiation in residency is still prevalent, though not as great as that 60%. If you look at residency spots per capita and population, there's a significant disproportionate amount along the Northeast corridor and actually in Ohio and Michigan specifically. Those Michigans, I don't understand Michigan. It's got a quarter of the population of California, yet it has equal amount of residency spots, despite having 1/4 of the population. So every hospital is a teaching program, everyone's got a residency. You can, if you're a Michigan resident, I was a Pennsylvania resident. If you qualified for medical school, you're going to school in Pennsylvania because they would take a Pennsylvania resident. And that's how it should be for states, right? If you're trying to fix if you're trying to fix pathways, you should have spots for those who qualify, but we don't have enough spots for those who are actually would be good doctors to be enrolled in programs within the state, unfortunately. So that's one of my lifelong goals, is to increase the undergraduate, which we refer to medical school as undergraduate, just to clarify. Only in medicine do we call graduate students undergraduate, because you still got to go to school afterwards. So where I'm trying to increase undergraduate enrollment here in the state, I work with Prime. Prime is one of the programs I love with, but also just how do we increase in general, but also with residencies. After you graduate from med school, I'm an emergency medicine doctor, so is Dr. Martin Moreno, my wife's a pediatrician. You know, you have to go and do a residency in those things. And those things are disproportionately not allocated in California. But on top of that, those California slots are almost all allocated in 3 regions, basically. It's San Diego, LA, and Bay Area. Those 3 regions constitute 75% of all the slots. So even though they actually don't represent 75% of all the population base, our population of the San Joaquin, 4.5 million people, and so we're 8% of the state's population. We do not represent even close to 8% of the residency positions in there. So there's all sorts of geographic misrepresentation, and some people built it in this trickle-down economy effect where, oh, we'll just train them in LA or train them in Philadelphia and they'll go to the Valley or they'll go to rural Arizona, and just time and time again, studies show that doesn't work. What happens is that when you train people, they stay where they train. They stay where they're from. There's 3 biggest determinants to see where physicians practice. Where did you grow up? Where'd you go to high school? Where did you finish? Where do you train? And where do you particularly finish training, your last large bit of training? And ultimately, and the third funny factor is where's your significant other from, which is kind of tied to the first one. So, but it's basically the same idea as where you're from determines that. So we can get people where they're from. We need to open up pathways so people who are from the areas that are underserved, like the Valley, can have opportunities to go to med school and then finally finish their training, both in medical school and residency here, so that then they're pretty much assured to be practicing physicians in there. It's harder to recruit in and pull people in, because when you travel away, I have so many students who have gone for anesthesia and neurology, say they'll come back, but you know what happens is I have a dermatologist absolutely committed to go, and then you go to residency down south and meet your significant other who doesn't want to leave now. Has met someone from there and doesn't want to come back, and then I get it. It's a 2-person decision now, and so now they're stuck, and now they're not coming back, and that happens all the time. So that's the biggest thing about residency. Residency is a more complicated thing because it's a funding issue, Medicare funding and residency slots to hospitals. I don't have enough time to go into the details of that, because honestly, that you could get a master's in healthcare economics in order to explain that. But that's the 30,000-foot view on that. That yes, we are disproportionate in undergraduate, in medical school, and in residency spots.
Okay, and then a follow-up question to that, kind of going into your first point about the medical school. The medical school that you specifically are referring to founding, is that going to be the one for UC Merced, or is it separate? And I know we had a discussion about this too, so I think it's good to answer.
Absolutely, lots of confusion over this. So once again, I work for UCSF right up here, right on the virtual screen in the background here. At UCSF Fresno. We are part of UCSF, right? I work at a branch campus in Fresno that works for the greater campus at San Francisco. UC Merced is the only UC campus in the San Joaquin Valley. UC Merced is our partner in this expansion of Prime. So I'll give you the example right now. We are the clinical campus. I train you when you learn to deliver babies in OB and learn to see kids in pediatrics and learn to do mental health and psychiatry. But right now, those students that you'll be talking to later do their basic science, their F1 or their basic science studies in San Francisco. Right now, we're in the process with the state augmentation to move all 4 years of that training in med school here to the Valley. The primary partner of that basic science or F1 of learning biochemistry, gross anatomy, all those like classroom textbook classes will be UC Merced. So the gross oversimplification is UC Merced has the PhDs and the college campus. We have the physicians. So med school is a little complicated now because it's not really cut and dry, like 2 years of book study and 2 years of clinical, as they're all intermixed. But the idea is that UC Merced is our big partner in the non-clinical realm, where they'll be doing the classroom teaching and the PhD and the basic science teaching for anatomy and histology and all those things for medical school. So starting in 2027, all UCSF SJV Prime it'll be Prime Plus will be moved into the Valley. So you never actually leave the Valley. for medical school. And then starting in 2 years, UC Merced will open up a BSMD pathway program that will be announced shortly, where you can enroll at UC Merced and have an automatic admissions pathway right into SJV Prime and graduate with a UCSF degree. The idea is with additional funding, then we expand the class size from our pilot of 12 to up to 50 students, and that will lead the pathway to have an independent school. If you really want to get the details, you can read in on UC Riverside, and the Riverside had a very similar pathway through UCLA, and then they did that for a few years and then expanded till they were ready to have an independent. They were an independent undergraduate, but used their medical school in partnership with UCLA until now they're an independent medical school. So basically, we're following a similar path.
Great question and great answer. And then I have a last question that was put in the Q&A. How can we become involved with the COVID-19 Equity Project and/or HEAL?
I just put it in the chat there. So that's the link to the COVID Equity Project. On there, you'll also see where we can take volunteers. So it's there for you to have clinical volunteer hours, because I know a lot of people are, that was honestly, like I said, one of the starting points of the reasons to create it. So that way you can shadow, you can help register patients. We keep everybody safe. We make sure volunteers are stay out of certain areas. In particular, we're not having them in the warm zone, which is for our monoclonal antibodies for COVID positive patients right now. But absolutely, we want to make sure that this is an opportunity for undergraduates and pre-meds and pre-health students to have more chances for clinical care. We actually just started now with doing allied health. So I have nursing students. So I now, for the first time this past year, take on nursing students that have clinical coverage, and they get vaccines and do swabs and stuff like that as well. So if you have a clinical license, they actually do their schooling and get credit through that. So we can train the nurses of the Valley as well. And we're going to be doing similar programs with medical assistants and PAs and others as well. So that's all part of the need in the Valley. So I've historically concentrated on the physicians, but we know that, we need more than just physicians in healthcare. There's a shortage in everything.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bond, for answering our questions. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to share live or put into the Q&A, you can go ahead and raise your hand. The COVID Equity Project link is right above. It's the fresno.ucsf.edu. And then all you do is just /CEP, COVID Equity Project. Yep.
And there's a volunteer link on there. So just fill in the volunteer information and we can have you help out. We do about 50 mobile events. So we have our static site at Shaw, which is our large volume site, but we have a couple arms. One focuses on Latino and migrant health. And then we have a separate part looking at refugee health that's not necessarily Latino, but in Fresno, there's actually a large refugee population. We also have we're doing outreach with the LGBT+ community. So we've run a transgender clinic in the past before COVID, and we'll be restarting that kind of once the pandemic kind of settles down to an endemic stage. And so we have a lot of different arms that if people are interested in, and our biggest one is arm is going to be on homeless and indigent care. So lots more to come as we expand beyond. What we were doing was non-COVID, now we're doing COVID, now we're going back to kind of doing a spread of COVID and other outreach.
I do have another question that just popped up in the Q&A, and I'm trying to remember exactly the context that you mentioned this in, but it says, what does academic risk mean? And then in parentheses, you mentioned this when you were talking about admissions.
Yeah, so academic risk, talking about like specifically GPAs and MCATs. So MCAT percentiles and looking at, so the MCAT, I'll preface like what the MCAT's good for. The MCAT is a standardized test that's good at looking at your ability to memorize information and answer standardized test questions. So it is a very narrow part of being a physician. Having said that, that ability does not end with the MCAT. So I hear this all the time, like, I'm not good at standardized tests. I can't, my MCAT doesn't reflect my ability, blah, blah. I get that. Having said that, it's not going to end, right? You get into med school, we have these STEP exams that are national standardized tests. You have to pass them in order to continue, and you cannot get licensed without, you can't practice medicine. So you have to pass these USMLE step 1, 2, and 3. Dr. Martin Moreno is in emergency medicine. She will have to, at the end of she's taking standardized exams every year, these in-services, but they're in preparation for it when she finishes training to pass a board exam that also is a standardized test. So these are, when I use that as academic risk, that's an example of like academic risk of taking standardized exams. Another thing would be GPA. People talk about like, well, I had this GPA hiccup, blah, 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 and why you had that. but I was doing this and that. Everyone thinks they work really hard in college, but I'll tell you what, anyone who's gone to medical school will tell you whatever you think you are working hard in college, it is not relative to what you'll be doing in medical school. Medical school is difficult. Everyone who gets to medical school was the top 5% in their class. So all of a sudden, for the first time in your life, many of you will not be, well, you'll be in the bottom half of your class, struggling to keep up, struggling to pass, even though you were actually maybe in the past struggling to do very well. Now you're struggling just to get by. That doesn't mean you're not going to be a good physician. A lot of medical schools are really a gradeless system. It's really P equals MD. It's about competencies of getting you to what you need, where you need to be in order to be a competent physician. So that's what we talk about academic risk is I look at this student, this applicant and say, wow, this person's amazing. Look at all their community work. I can clearly see them being that rural psychiatrist I talked about in Fireball, that they just seem so passionate about mental health, and that's amazing. And then I look at their profile and say like, okay, their grades are a little low, their MCAT's a little low, here's their academic risk. So this is what I do is I like stack all these people and I'm trying to give out admissions and talk about like, well, how do we balance getting the people we want, but it's no good to me if you fail out basically. And how much academic support we're very supportive in our medical school. Most allopathic schools have to be, because it's actually one of the reporting things is once you get into medical school, it's actually really supportive because it's trying to get you through. That's why some of the licensures, if you look at, and not to be particular to anyone, but like many of the Caribbean schools, they don't have to meet US accreditation standards. So what they do is they enroll a lot of students and basically attrition out half their students, like where you get into, they let you, it's a sink or swim model where you just enroll a bunch of people and then the strong will survive and the good will just fail out. And that doesn't work in US allopathic schools. Our licensure doesn't allow that. So we're very restrictive on getting in, but once you're in, our job is to really make you a good physician and graduate you as a physician. That's really what we have to do. We have to graduate all the students we enroll, basically. So we're looking at the amount of support you need, the amount of academic risk. If you've had a hiccup, it doesn't mean it's the end of the world, but I want that hiccup to be justified. I don't, like what I'm looking for in admissions is why that hiccup happened and what you're doing about it. What I hear a lot is a lot of this, like, well, I'm not good, it's not my problem. It's, you know, I had family that was sick and I was breaking up with a boyfriend or girlfriend. And there's a lot of those things that I hear a lot about. And it's not that they're not true, but they don't, they end up adding to like a lot of what we see as excuses, like where they're like deferring the ownership or responsibility of the problems onto myself. What I want to see is somebody who's had a problem be like, okay, I've had problems with standardized exams. After my first MCAT, I took a course in this is why my score improved by that. I expect to need to do this continuously. I will always do test questions and will need academic support, but I much prefer that ownership of like, this is what I do. This is why I'm gonna do it. How do I attack the problem? Not this is someone else's problem. There's always an excuse for why that happens. So that's sort of, when I talk about academic risk, that's what I mean with it, but also what I mean is when you're talking about applying to medical school, what I mean about like responsibility over issues. It's not that there's no perfect candidate. It's not about perfection. It's holistic review really looks about what are we looking for in applicants. So I hope that answered the question. Sorry if I went a little deep into like looking at what academic risk and how we address it, you know.
No, I think you brought up a really good point. I always used to say that when I was a medical student, like once you're in, and they're going to do everything in their power to make sure you don't fail out.
Mm-hmm.
So that is exactly, I mean, it's the risk factor of if I let this person in academically, what's the struggle going to be? So,
yeah.
So Michael has now joined us. I know that at 6 o'clock, we're going to have our SJV Prime students chat. And it's about 5 till 6 right now. So if anyone has any last burning questions, or if Dr. Braun wants to say anything to kind of close out his portion of the panel, that'd be greatly appreciated.
All right, well, thanks. I just want to thank everyone for having me on. I hope it was entertaining, inspiring, answered some questions. I kind of like to pull the curtain back that people don't get to see sometimes. And talking from someone who actually does admissions and reviews for over a decade. And I'm not going to be on this second panel, both because I got to pick up my kids from soccer practice, but also because I was on the admissions panel for all these prime students, and I don't even want to talk about it with them in their face. So you guys can have some one-on-one time with them. Obviously, they're going to talk about other things, but they talk about being a physician. So I almost feel embarrassed having them talk while I'm sitting there. So I don't want to hear that. So, but I just want to say, like, think about your story and how to tell your story, and be true to yourself. you know, we talk about burnout in medicine and difficulties of getting in and all these things. And I just say that I am still the doctor that I was on my med school application 25 years ago. And that's really, it sounds simple, but I just kind of read it and say, that's what I want it to be. And that's just the same things hold true today. And we do a great job of taking young, inspiring doctors and sort of beating that out of them sometimes with all the work and hours, and they get burnt out and just want to get a job afterwards. And I hope that I can show that you can still hold true to that, still love your job, still be successful in it, and still hold true to the young, 22-year-old kid who was, wanting to be a doctor and applying back in the day. A little older, a little fatter, but, still that young kid. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Dr. Bond. Thank you so much.
Take care, guys. Good luck.
We'll let you take off.
That was great. Thank you, Dr. Bond. We always love having him. He's so much fun. And I think he really gives some great insight as far as someone who is on the other side of the admissions, side of things. So it's nice to hear from him. So thank you, Dr. Bond, off picking up his kids from soccer. He's dad too, so don't worry. So I'm going to go ahead and share the link again to the certificate. If you want to do that during the break, go ahead and take a look at that. Let's be back maybe in 5 minutes, a couple minutes after 6. And we'll get started with Michael, and we'll have some other students joining us later, but they're residents, they're busy. So they're going to jump on in a few minutes after 6, but we'll start with some medical school journeys in just a minute. So let's take 5 and be back here about 3 minutes after 6. And I'll plot their certificate link in the chat.
Awesome.